This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So, welcome, good afternoon. In Venezuela we say that this is the hora del burro, but as everyone that will have chaired the conference will know, hora del burro, this is the siesta time, this is the time when all our blood flows to our stomachs. But actually, that's completely impossible with the eminent speakers that we have to speak to us for the next little while. As John outlined, the objective of this panel is to discuss the worldwide legacy of Chavez. We have our two speakers, Mr. Ken Livingstone, a major figure in British politics. I think formally his political career started when he served on the Lambeth and Camden Council, becoming the leader of the GLC in 1981. I think probably politics was running in his veins earlier than that. He was Labour MP from 1987 to 2000, and then in 2001 was elected the newly created role of Mayor of London. And it was during this period, which he served for 2 terms, that he developed, I think, a partnership in many ways with Chavez and Chavez's government, and they developed a close personal relationship. So it is a real honour that he is speaking here today. And then we also have Ambassador Diego Arria, a Venezuelan economist, politician and diplomat. In the mid-70s, a great parallel, he was governor of the Federal District of Caracas. In the early 90s, the Venezuelan permanent representative to the United Nations and president of the United Nations Security Council. He now serves a variation of roles, board chairman of a financial services company, Arria, and then also advisor to many think tanks, including the Inter-American Dialogue. So I pass on to Mr. Livingstone.
I think when we look at Hugo Chavez's legacy in terms of the international situation, I think what is inspiring about his legacy is that he survived as long as he did. The position that we find in so much of the world is any emerging leader who challenges the status quo, the predominance of American corporate might in their area, often gets destabilised, assassinated, overthrown. I mean, we haven't got long enough, because I only got 15 minutes. I could list the number of interventions the United States of America made in Central and Latin America over the last 200 years. The list is almost endless. And of course, the first real setback for the United States was the Cuban Revolution. Before that, small interruptions, where governments were overthrown. I remember as I started to be interested in politics, and politics didn't play my part. When I left school, I wanted to be a keeper at London Zoo. They had no vacancies, so blame them. I watched the overthrow of the Brazilian government in 1964, and a whole series of other interventions, like the Dominican Republic, and still today we see the row that's erupted about the United States using the internet to help stir up opposition both in Cuba and in Venezuela because these governments stand out like a sore thumb. Why is this? If you step back, I recently was interviewed by George Galloway, who's doing a documentary film about the legacy of Tony Blair, and you won't be surprised when it's not overwhelmingly favorable. And while we're talking about it, when you step back and look at this last 70, 80 years, it would have been cheaper for the West just to buy the oil from the Middle East countries and Venezuela, rather than all the interventions, all the setbacks, the upheavals. Imagine if in 1953 the American government hadn't overthrown the Mossadegh regime in Iran. There might never have been an Ayatollah. It might have developed into a stable democracy. But what was upsetting them? The proportion of the returns on the oil of Iran going to the Iranian people was 16%. Here in Britain we were getting 32%. And this basically is at the core of all this. I started out in politics thinking conspiracy theorists were mainly loonies and nutters sort of lining up to join UKIP one day, no doubt. But in the passage of time I've been surprised at how many of these things have been revealed to be true. And so what's, I think, important about the legacy of Chavez is he survived as long as he did, and he saw a big redistribution of wealth. I'm not saying everything that they did was right. The last time I went to Venezuela was the autumn of 2008. I remember a long meeting with my economics advisors from City Hall and the then finance minister in Venezuela, where we were saying, you're making a great mistake here. You're sitting on a vast pile of unused wealth that you've amassed. You should be investing that in a massive program of infrastructure. And almost all the recent consensus amongst economists is that investment is responsible for a majority of the growth in any economy. And I think many of the problems that still assail Venezuela today stem from that lack of core investment in infrastructure. Never say, we want to say much the same about the United Kingdom. I think also what is interesting about Chavez, when I first met him, I mean, all I'd known was what I'd read in the papers, was he remained an ordinary person. He had extraordinary achievements, but there was nothing about him that's going to lead him to sort of, had he not died, want to end up worth 20 or 30 million. He was there because of what he could do. He was there because of the things he wanted to change. And in that I think is what makes great politicians. You're there not because you want to be there, which tragically is all too often what motivates people to drive into Downing Street or into the White House, but you're there for what you can do and what you can achieve. And the achievements are immense. As they, not everything worked perfectly, there are still major problems. But there are very few countries who saw such a shift of wealth from the richest and the elite down to the broad mass of the population. Here in Britain, as in America, in the last 35 years, the inequalities of wealth have doubled. Chavez demonstrated that doesn't have to be an endemic part of how things operate. Where are we today in terms of his legacy? What's interesting, if you go back and look at the history, Cold War, which I grew up in, and my broad assumption that these were two equally unpleasant regimes in the United States and in the Soviet Union. But with the sort of remarkable way in which the United States of America isn't very good at keeping its secrets. There's a wonderful line in one of John le Carre's spy novels where he's dealing with a spy, a British spy, who's actually a KGB agent. So he's an MI6, but he's working with KGB. He's in America, and he's talking to his KGB controller. KGB controller says, what's awful about spying in America is you risk your life to get something. And the following week it's on the front page of the government papers. And so much has now come out that the Cold War was being planned whilst the Second World War was still continuing. 2 years before, within what was the forerunner of the CIA, an internal document states it is only possible for one ideology to be dominant in the world. We have to plan for this. We now know that in Roosevelt's government, there were two great factions, that around Roosevelt himself, who saw the prospect of a deal with the Soviet Union and a peaceful post-war world, and those others who feared, actually, looks bizarre now, knowing what we know about Stalin's regime, that if people in Europe and other parts of the world had a free choice, they might vote for Stalinist type communism, as it becomes so attractive during the Second World War because of the heroism of the Russian people. And what you actually look at now as you pour back over all of that is that those great corporations who had doubled in size during the war because of the war economy, their fear was that with the end of the war they collapsed back into the Great Depression. And these two strands, those hard-line right-wing ideologues like George Keenan, who saw inevitable conflict in communism and capitalism, and those who feared the end of the war would push the economy back into the sort of problems of the 1930s, and so they wanted a conflict. And that was what dominated the world. So if you actually want to look at the detail, it's been brought together in a very good book by Oliver Stone, and also technical teaching made out, of course, the book's on a lot more of the detailed stuff, the analysis, the minutes of meetings inside the White House and so on. All this unfolded. Even, the first great political crisis I remember, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were all being told the Soviet Union was overtaking the West, we had to spend more on arms. At that stage, for every intercontinental ballistic missile that the Soviet Union had, America had 100. The imbalance, and we were all lied to, was the problem came with the collapse of the Soviet Union. How do you sustain that military level of expenditure? And still today, America is responsible for over 45% of military spending in the world. And there will be a huge disruption. At the end of the Second World War, as they did have a short-term scaling down, it pushed the American economy into a 10% reduction of GDP by 1946. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you need to fortunately for Latin America, that was seen as an uninteresting backwater. And of course, we had that wonderful little book by Huntington talking about clash of civilizations, saying at the end of the Soviet Union, it now be a clash between the West and Islam and the West and China. And I don't need to talk to you about the clash between the West and Islam that's gone on over this last decade and a half. But even today, Obama is trying to lock down a trade pact with the Pacific nations which excludes China. And this is the context against which you see the background of Hugo Chavez. All my life, we've had a world dominated by American corporate interests. Those who stood up to it usually were overthrown, killed, or massively undermined by the opposition being supported by the United States of America. And when you look at the consequence of that, what do we have today? 85 billionaires in this world own more wealth than half the population put together. And throughout my career, I seldom invoked the International Monetary Fund, but their recent report argued the growing inequality of wealth damages our economy. The more the inequality of wealth in the world, or within any one nation, the greater the cycle of boom and bust, the more erratic the economy. And Chavez, I think, like so many other leaders around the world, challenging this orthodoxy, points the way in a different direction. And thus, it encouraged Chavez's survival in that coup in 2002. He told me how, because the generals who led that coup, they weren't certain it would hold, they weren't prepared to kill themselves, and he was taken away to that little island, locked in a room with one soldier with a submachine gun, and 3 Americans were thrown in to kill him. They were ushered into the room. The soldier, clearly not an idiot, realised that after they killed Chavez, they would kill the witness, him. He turned that gun on them and said, "Leave the room, I'll kill you." That crucial moment, and it was the turning point that allowed the Venezuelan transformation to actually continue. It's a very good and clear sign for the forces people like Chavez are up against. It takes courage to resist. If you're prepared to give in, serve America's interests, you'll be well looked after, very much like some of their own prominent politicians who now passed into retirement. And that really is the legacy of Chavez. He survived, he demonstrated you can have a huge transformation of wealth, and that is why still today America is funding the opposition, stirring up the sort of riots, over 40 people killed in the last few months. And I have to say, when you get people protesting in the rich enclaves, it may be an indication this is not a mass movement, and it hasn't spread to the vast majority of Venezuela, where people still see their quality of life dramatically improved by Hugo Chavez. That is his legacy. That's why America will continue to do everything it can to undermine it, as it will be doing in other countries around the world until the New World Order finally comes into being. Because that New World Order isn't really going to be the one Huffington talked about. World divided between West and Islam or China. China's economy overtake America by the end of this decade. By the middle of this century, the West will be just a player in a genuine global economy. We will no longer be able to set the economic rules for our own benefit, export our inflation, and dominate the world in the way that we have for the last 70 years. And I think that will be a better world than the one I've lived in so far in my life. Thank you very much.
Ladies, gentlemen, it's amazing. I tell you it's a pleasure because I used to be a fellow governor of Caracas, as I told you. And I hope when I speak today, I will not incur any sort of congestion tax. Thank you. That's always really a great idea. I've never seen Singapore did it. After listening to some of all of the speakers today, I believe it's important to define what do we mean with legacy. Because the way I read it or heard, there are many interpretations of legacy. So I want to pick up the Oxford Dictionary. Legacy is when you will resources or monies to some other people. Also, the legacy is when you expect all the people who passed away will remember you. I summarize my words today. I said the Chavez legacy is a legacy of violence, confrontation, and destruction. I had the opportunity to meet Mr. Chavez in a different way as the mayor that you met him. In February 4, 1992, I arrived from the United Nations to see the president in the morning, and I entered with him in the Palace of Miraflores at 5 o'clock in the morning, and there was blood all over the threshold of his office of a lieutenant that had been sent to kill Carlos Neves Perez. At the same time, today's Minister of Interior and Justice, General Rodriguez Torres, was heading an attack to assassinate the wife of the president, the daughter of the president, and one of the granddaughters, in what seems to be the only case in Latin America when an attempt to the life of the wife and family of the president have been attempted. So as you can imagine, he did not create a very good impression on me. I would like to refer some of the points you made because I think they're very important, and I cannot lose the opportunity to have you, who has been a defender of human rights, very well known as a human rights defender, to not only to talk about the past, but to talk what's happening today. Chavez is alive and kicking. He's not dead. I mean, what's happening today in Venezuela are the consequences of 14 years previous in a systematic effort to reorganize the society in a different way, to create a model which is counter to begin with. It's counter and violates our own constitutional framework because he created a parallel constitution or a parallel government in a way, a parallel central bank, a parallel social funds, a parallel Ministry of Finance. That, of course, lead me to tell you the following. When I say, and the legacy, for example, of the will, what you leave behind, Chavez left behind 200 billion debt, left behind when he came into power in by the way, legally, constitutionally, democratically in 1998. Actually, the last time we really had a transparent election, we had 4,000 people being killed annually in the violent way. Today we have 25,000. That's part of I'm not saying that this is directly attributed to him, but this has happened since he became president. I never forgotten when the president said, Charles at the time, on public television, sitting next to the president of the Supreme Court Justice and the Minister of Defense, if you are hungry, don't you think that you have the right to steal, etc., etc.? That was the first message to the country that said that impunity would be an issue in Venezuela, which is today rampant. I heard the word narrative a lot today. You want to hear the Chavez narrative? I prefer the Garcia Marquez narrative or Vargas Llosa narrative. The narrative of Chavez was a narrative to try to subvert actually the region. But it comes before, because probably I should say this at the outset. There are millions of people who adore Chavez. And they truly, in a genuine way, really love the man. Because he really had a great capacity to communicate from a human point of view with a lot of people. I never put that down. What I complain and contend is that a few group of people, not only Venezuela, but in other countries outside Venezuela, have used actually the resources of Venezuela and detriment of our own interests. And actually that's what has happened. Now, the and Mr. Chavez, and legacy has been, you see it today, for example. The people, I hear people in the streets who tell me, I am a Chavista, but I'm not a Madurista. So it's beginning turn, it's very difficult to transfer whatever he was. I think it's terrible to talk to someone who's passed away, but he's not this anyone. He will be in the Venezuelan history forever. For me, for some, I'm saying for good reasons, I would say for reasons that really are terrible, because of the way I'm telling you. But this is a historical fact. This man will be forever. I remember in Argentina, they criticized Perón. Perón will be with Argentina forever. It is regardless what you may think of Perón, of Fidel Castro, whatever. Bring me to the issue of Cuba. There is a minuscule country in the Caribbean, or Cuba, 6 or 7 times smaller than Venezuela, less rich than Venezuela, 9 million people, 10 million people, who controls my country. When I tell you controls my country, it is I tell you fully. They control the notaries, the registries, they actually produce our passports, manufacture our identity papers. They control, and they have a thorough control on the armed forces of my country, on the police and intelligence and apparatus in the country. And we have, during our independence war with Spain, the Spanish never sent more than 25,000 soldiers in our country. We have 60,000 killed. I'm not saying they're all soldiers. But the Cubans have at least 4,000 or 5,000 people who are very actively engaged into the police, intelligence, operations, and the armed forces of Venezuela. What does that mean in the legacy? It means that after 200 years of our independence, we have to regain our independence, and it will be misdemeanor from the Cubans. It will not be for the Americans. Because, by the way, the empires, like Chavez used to call them, there are more empires, as you said very well, the Chinese are becoming very soon a bigger empire. Actually, this year, and ahead of time than what they thought. The empire is the only income that Venezuela has today is coming from the United States. Because the rest, we were paying the Chinese for debts, and we are giving away, as you know, to many people in the world. We're subsidizing fuel, we're giving away at the cost of about $90 billion to Venezuela. The legacy of Chavez will be preserved forever and for many other reasons. No one has spent $90 billion into a personal ego trip like this man did throughout his life. I mean, we bought 2/3 of the organization of American states. We bought votes, accommodations, complicities all over the region. And I would say in a very shameful way, my country, the way it was to be, we were, Mr. Mayor, the most active promoters of freedom in many of the countries in the region. We have the Argentinians, we have the Brazilians, we have the Guatemalans, we have the Salvadorians, we have the Chileans, we have the Haitians. There's no country in the region that Venezuela before was not covered. I see my friend Cajaga there, and she knows how we did, for example, in protecting the Muslims in Europe during the Bosnian War. I've seen enough conflicts all over the world to understand that the international community expects always and waits until you get 200,000 people killed in Bosnia, 20,000 women get raped, or 500,000 people killed in Rwanda, or 2 million in Congo, and then the international community moves. You said, well, we have 41 people left. It sounds terrible, but there are no crimes against humanity. Only one person is enough to consider a crime against humanity. Only one person. And throughout this process, we have been suffering as part of the legacy, which had never happened ever before, which is a massacre of students. Chavez never did it. Chavez attempted to do it, and that's when he was forced to resign, because he was forced to resign, no doubt about that, in 2002, when he wanted to bring the tanks and the army refused to do it. But he never afterwards moved the army to attack students and young people. You know, we have, the mayor, students of 20 years old were violated with a rifle. I mean, it is, regardless of what political position you have, you cannot be in agreement that these things have happened before the eyes of the world. And now people, we have been the victims, not only of indifference. We haven't been able to compete even with the crisis in Kiev, because it overshadowed us at the time of our greatest plight. Then the images on television and radio were so powerful that we couldn't even compete. Our victims were even more victims because of that situation. You mentioned something which caught my attention, which is you mentioned the sense of inspiration. The sense of inspiration in Venezuela has been found by the students. The students, you said that there are few that are not propagating. Let me tell you, why not? If you see the pictures in the newspapers, on the images on television, they are not what you would imagine, the blue eyes, blonde Venezuela. They are all the color, we're a multicolored society. And the fact, and I heard this morning, that there are people that say they are in the rich part of the city. To begin with, it's not ridiculous, because even in the rich part of the city is not a problem. On the other side is where what Dr. Palma was saying this morning, is what the colectivos are. And the colectivos are precisely the people who are armed, and they will not allow, they know who goes out to the protest. But when you see in the streets who are protesting, these are not the rich kids, like some people would say, or the wealthy kids. These are wealthy, poor, all kinds of the society. There is today, actually, I would say a revolt, not against the government in a way, it's a revolt to promote, to rescue freedom, to rescue liberties, to rescue the right to live in peace, and I think an attempt to reunify the country. If you don't, I tell you something, my dear friend. I tell you this with heavy heart. It is not easy to speak about the problems of your country. There was a time I was Minister of Information when my responsibility was to promote good things about my country. I never thought, when I was in the Security Council, for defending other causes, that one day I will have to come out of different parts of the world to talk about our own tragedy. And let me tell you something, this is very painful. It doesn't give any pleasure to talk about this. It doesn't give any pleasure to take a position against whatever you may say. No, I thought that there's a wonderful opportunity. You are an important politician. You are respected. And I hope that the things I'm telling you today in this opportunity may help us. Because helping us will not be one part of the population. It's help the Venezuelans. If we do not reunify the country, we better have an opportunity. And to me, I don't see them as Chavistas or non-Chavistas or Maoistas. I see them as Venezuelans. And as Venezuela, we must reunify. And I'm sure, and I always say that the day that we, the Venezuelans, learn that this is possible, we will be able to do great things. That time has already arrived, and I hope you can help. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're open for questions. Would you please give your name and then please do ask a question.
I don't mind if you want to just criticise me. I'm used to it.
Mainly from Venezuela. One of the things that worries me the most and it hurts is that one of the legacies of Chavez is the division of the country. He put hate to the Venezuelans, who are divided now into groups. We used to be for one party, the other party. We could go to a baseball game, swear to each other that we were Venezuelans. And the other day I heard a student mentioning, I have two grandmothers. One is Chavista and the other one is opposition. But both need medicines for their heart tension and they cannot get it. That is the situation we have. That is the legacy that we are inheriting from Chavez.
Could you tell us perhaps how much of Venezuela's money was it invested in London transport, and how do you justify that money being spent on the most wealthy capital in the world when it could have been spent on healthcare, education and all the other needs of the poor people of the barrios of Venezuela?
I mean, when Chavez came to see me, he been negotiating a deal with Senator Robert Kennedy's son, who was then a member of the House of Representatives, to provide cheap oil for heating for people on the east coast of the United States of America. He offered a similar deal to us, that a £13 million less to pay for the cost of the fuel we use in our buses, and we use that money to provide half fares for people who are out of work. And so it's a redistribution of wealth. And he did things like that all over the country. And this is, I suppose, where I say to Diego, don't worry about having to travel around the world criticising your government. I do it all the time, and I love it. It's not, we shouldn't be surprised or upset that society is divided. They always have been. On the walls of the pyramids in Egypt, there are hieroglyphics depicting the strike by the builders building the pyramids. This thing has been endemic between those who have and those who don't. And think of, perhaps, we can always disagree, but certainly in the top, I think the greatest American president of all time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, others put in behind Lincoln, but one of the great ones who lifted America out of depression, made mistakes, but also geared up to be part of the struggle against the greatest evil in human history, in terms of the Nazis. On the day he died, the corporate bosses in New York sent their secretaries out to buy more booze for the impromptu parties. Journalists wrote a book about 20 years after Roosevelt's death depicting this. Secretaries with tears running down their cheeks, pouring the drinks to their bosses who were celebrating the death of the greatest president in American history. So don't go through life assuming one day you can create a happy, united nation where we're all on the same side. Not in my lifetime, but I suspect in anyone's lifetime. In every society there's a struggle between a small elite who have a lot of wealth and the vast bulk of the population. The very clever elites incorporate the bulk of the population in sharing their values. Occasionally that breaks down. Chavez is part of that. I wouldn't disagree that there are huge problems now, inflation, all of that, but on balance, overwhelmingly, the man was right. And people are better off in Venezuela than we haven't challenged it. Look at Cuba. Many of you may have read that book about inequality in Britain. What's it called? Spirit. Yes, the Spirit Devil. Towards the end, all the charts about the main Western economies, towards the end was talking about the whole global economy, life expectancy. Cuba is the only country in the third world where life expectancy beats that in the United States of America. I'd have disagreements with much that Fidel did. On balance, you judge. You'll never get someone who's wholly good or wholly bad, all make mistakes. But show me leaders united their country. If Roosevelt couldn't, I doubt if anyone else is going to.
And a figure?
In the end, the figure?
Yeah, thanks. My name's Jeremy Fox. I get the impression on listening to not only your two interventions, but this morning, and indeed some of the rather leading questions, including the last one, that we are in the presence of a dialogue of death, and the dialogue is on. But no one is listening to anyone else, and this is the impression one gets from both the newspapers here, and I have to say from your interventions. It seems to me that if there's to be a solution in Venezuela, you have to go beyond these kinds of rather snarling criticisms and to look at how the country can come together in some kind of proper dialogue. And that's a challenge that's facing the United Kingdom as well, perhaps in a slightly less violent manner. And I would listen very carefully to what Ken Livingstone has to say, because although he doesn't appear to be, I imagine that he's got quite a few wounds on his back in the battles that he's fought. But his speech, what he's told us today, is in fact rather conciliatory. And it seems to me that that's one of the things that we have, may I suggest, I'm not Venezuelan, but I'm medio Latinoamericano, that we should try and look for, rather than to listen to opposing parties who seem to have very little in common, rather than the snarling distaste for each other. Sorry about that. like this. So my question really, is a question, is how do you come together? How do you resolve this kind of mutual hostility that seems to be coming over from the various interventions to produce something which will be at least livable?
You know, I understand fully well the feelings about it. Let me tell you something. I am myself, like all the Venezuelans who spoke here today, some of us are at least, at a disadvantage because we're returning to our countries. And for example, I didn't say it when we introduced it, but last week the government decided that 5 of us were terrorists. Accused the president of a bank, Garcia Mendoza, accused Maria Corina Machado, accused Rafael Alfonso, the president of Celice, which is a think tank, and myself as terrorists. So I should allow to my next presentation. This is the process of intimidation of people. Why? They want to keep you sensitive, that you may be put in jail anytime. I said many years ago in my own country when this happened, I said, they're going to liquidate each one by one. The problem is that you have the numbers in your back and you think it's with somebody else. I heard today also, linked to that there is a process of dialogue and negotiation. There is not a dialogue. I've been in dialogues of international peace and conflicts. This is not a dialogue. What's happening was a good transaction. The transaction consisted that UNASUR went to Venezuela, not at the request of the opposition, came at the request of the regime. Unfortunately, I have to say, a friend of mine, Gerardo Muñoz, the Chilean foreign minister, was my colleague at the United Nations, even before arriving to Venezuela, said, we cannot allow a small minority, a violent minority, to remove an democratically elected president. The mediator never said that. Before the minister of Brazil went even further. He said, an amnesty law is too premature. I mean, we haven't even sit down at the table, he started making these comments, which immediately disqualified. But which was the end result of this conversation? On television, the president gave an impression of tolerance, listening to some of the criticism. And the political parties belong in something called, I would say in Spanish, mood, not in English. Mood is a political party of some of the politics, which is important, but is today not representative of the majority of the people, including people who are not in the opposition. The mood had a private meeting with the foreign minister of Venezuela and told each one of them how many people have been tortured, their names, the photograph, who was violent with the rifle, and at the end, the agreement, because one of the people, one of his delegation told me, said, listen, the politicians told us exactly what happened. Why, when they went on television, they didn't say all those things in black and white? Because they had made an agreement. You don't talk whether Maduro is Venezuelan or not Venezuelan, we still don't know. You don't talk against the armed forces of Venezuela. You don't put faces to the people who have been killed. You don't attack the armed forces. And if you do that, we'll sit down and talk. Exactly what that's what happened. So one side became official. Actually, the government chose its own position. And at the same time, the government gained before the world an image of tolerance, which was, after all, a reality according to what it was presented. I think it's very important to recognize.
Yes. I'm Juan Urdaneta. I'm a trustee of Clearing House, and also I work for Standard Bank. Mr. Mayor, you said that an interesting statistic that about 85 people, billionaires in this world, own about 50% of the wealth. And then also, I can think, you talk about redistribution of wealth. And in Venezuela, there's been redistribution of wealth, and you throw a hypothesis out there that could be actually possible, but it has to be proven. But perhaps 85 people or less than 85 people in the actual government own more than 50% of the financial wealth of Venezuela. And that's all around the world, and there's statistics about that. So I want to ask you two questions. But before asking the first one is, you also said that you took the deal of taking $32 million as a subsidy for the buses in London because it was too good a deal to leave on the table. And I think that was quoted in the Financial Times. And I remind you that people on their income support in this country, they make £7 or about that, you have the exact figure, but £7 a day, 7 days a week. That's more than what a rich person makes in Venezuela on their salary. So the first question is, do you think that there's been a redistribution of wealth in the country and that most of the politicians have this wealth now? And number two is, why did you took advantage of the Venezuelan people? There's people are really poor. So what are your principles? Why do you think the distribution of wealth like that? It's a completely subsidy from the poor to the rich people on their income support in this country.
Can I say, I know that Chavez did not set aside Swiss bank accounts that were filled up. People from many parties in countries all over the world, that sort of corruption, sadly, is fairly endemic in a lot of our politics. And if it's happening in Venezuela by members of the government, I denounce that. I took that money because it was a redistribution of wealth towards the poorest people in London, the Londoners without work. And in exchange, we offered advice on what should be done to modernise the infrastructure of the cities of Venezuela and so on. And tragically, of course, I lost the election to one of the great forces of evil in human history. And he cancelled the deal just as Transport for London opened an office, was starting and give advice. I have to say, if you look at the bus service now it's absolutely virtually like a disgrace. Nowhere in the world needs a congestion charge more than, when you're in Caracas, the radio says, if you're driving to work today, take a lunch, a bottle of water and a book to read, because you might be stuck in a jam ground. It's a nightmare. So he would have done a lot better, actually. That 13 million a year we were getting, can you imagine what international consultants would have charged to give advice about how to deal with the infrastructure of your city? Which is much more. So no, it was a good deal for both sides. And after I lost the election, I went out to do the first was what we hope to be a series of meetings. Chavez's candidates for the mayoral elections in Venezuela and Mayor Caracas. But sadly, his candidate didn't get elected Mayor Caracas, and the candidate who did wouldn't have had me anywhere within 100 yards of him. So they didn't take that advice, but I think that's part of the problem you see now. I'm very much on the radical left, but I'm always interested in what the facts are. If someone can demonstrate a different way is a better way of doing things, I'll buy into that. I've never allowed my broad ideology to distort the reality of the facts on the ground. And I do think there are a lot of mistakes that clearly things could have been done different and better. But the defining issue is the vast majority of people in Venezuela, in terms of their lifespan, their education, their literacy, are better than they were before. And hopefully the juror will build on that, not repeat the mistakes that have been made. But I'm ready to give advice to anyone around the world. Well, no, not always. I was invited to Saudi Arabia last month. I turned that down. It's the most abhorrent regime.
Thanks, Bro. If Venezuelan Chavismo showed that the way to escape inequality and fix your society is to escape American corporate imperialism that's existed since the Second World War, where does Chile in its success fit into that model?
Its success not surely under Pinochet.
No, today in being one of there are two, South Korea and Chile have joined the high rank of the OECD in terms of being considered developed, and it's about $2,000 per capita away from being considered a developed country, and it has far, far less inequality than it used to do. And as Dick said earlier, you would struggle to find a shanty in Chile.
Yes, but Chile could have had that a generation ago if the Americans hadn't arranged the overthrow of the democratically elected government and its destabilisation. That's the reality of it. We watched that coup, and that's the reality. Chile ran into economic problems because America undermined the democratically elected government. Kissinger flew representatives of the Chilean opposition to Washington and took part in the planning of that coup. They authorised the killing of the general who was leading the Chilean armed forces, who wasn't prepared to take part in that coup. And it locked Chile into how many thousands of protesters and left-wingers killed? Same true in the Argentine. If I'd been born in Chile or the Argentine, I wouldn't be alive today. I'd been one of the leftists dragged off to a stadium and then executed. That is the tragedy of Chile. And if you go back to the end of the Second World War, I think Argentina was one of the top fifth or sixth most advanced country in the world. The Perón government was a disaster for Chile. No doubting about that. But Latin America could have been very much more farther advanced if it had been allowed to develop its own economic base without it being subordinated to the United States of America.
I don't know if it's the opinion of the panelists that the European left, just because Chavez has this anti-American speech, they have been supporting Chavez, although the people in the country is suffering. Me myself, I need to leave Caracas, left Caracas 7 years ago because my fiancé got killed because someone tried to steal his car. So I don't know if who owns the bank, who owns PDVSA, who runs the economy, but when people need to leave a country because their loving family has been killed, kidnapped, sorry, but this is not any legacy to remember. It's just to forget or to change.
So let me remind now to you, which Boris has continued, and I think is one of the most significant, is the year after I became mayor, 222 Londoners were murdered. Today that figure's been halved. It's halved because I recruited, we had 25,000 police, I took it up to 35,000, and we had resources there to tackle, and we had a successful prosecution. We ended up convicting 70% of murders when I was elected. Today it's 98%. And crime is horrific. But it isn't just in Venezuela and Latin America. Look at Mexico. I don't know the detailed analysis of what fuels crime in Venezuela, but in much of Latin America it's linked to the drug trade. And this is one of the catastrophic errors of the Western governments. Nixon and Kissinger in 1969 imposed this war against drugs. Countries like Britain ended up having to change our laws to conform to that war on drugs. Here in Britain in the 1960s, if you were a heroin addict, you registered with the state, local doctor, he gave you clean heroin, and we had about 4,000 registered addicts nationally. That was stopped. You immediately created a market for the drug cartels. Now, I'm not saying, even as a conspiracy theorist, I'm not saying Kissinger and Nixon intended that. It's the unintended consequence. And the death toll, much of it linked to drugs in Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico, and other parts of Latin America, is a disaster. And I do think the emerging challenge to that in some Latin American countries about the need to shift away from that war on drugs, recognise this as a medical problem, would do a lot to undermine that. But I'm not. I mean, I'm a retired pensioner. I don't have access to vast store of data about what's actually happening in the crime rate in London anymore, let alone what's happening in Venezuela. But I suspect that is irrespective of who would or would not be the president. It's that catastrophic error of judgment about how we tackle the drugs problem.
You know, I'm happy that you brought the issue of drugs. You know, Venezuela, according to the United Nations, has become the most important exporter of cocaine. 60% of the cocaine exported to Europe comes from Venezuela. About 10% comes to the UK. So actually, the accommodation of the regime for so many years have hurt the Europeans. I always ask some of the ambassadors of the European countries, how come you do not complain that they are hurting your countries? You know, Honduras was to be, now we are ahead. We have reached certain pinnacles after great efforts. One is to become the most important exporter of drugs. Second is to beat Sudan as the highest inflation in the world. And Venezuela has become a perfect habitat for all kinds of drug dealers. We have, Mr. Mayor, Mexicans, Colombians, Russians, all kinds of cartels. Why? You know, and this, I'll give you a fact. There are today 7 generals indicted by the U.S. Treasury for trafficking with arms and trafficking with drugs. None of them have attempted to defend themselves. There is a list of another 50 more, which links directly to what was actually the crown or the hierarchy of the military. And that, of course, has corrupted greatly the armed forces, which today are not only corrupted that way, but also linked to the Cuban system. And the next point I want to tell you, there is this book that was read now, Capitalism in the 21st Century, this French economist, Piketty. And with the issue of inequality, as you see, he studied very well what happened in England, 18th century, from the 18th century, in France especially, very thoroughly. And you come to the conclusion it's getting worse today in inequality. It is not only in countries like, actually in countries like ours, it might even get better before achieve the level of Europeans. The only point we have to do, you know, there is no subsidy, no charity that can compensate the pain inflicted on the poor people, the poorest people, through a fatal combination of assassination, violence, inflation, crime. There's nothing worse than that combination.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately we have come to the end of today. I just want to make 3 points before we will move. One is to say an immense thank you both to our 2 esteemed speakers now, but also to those who have spoken throughout today. Secondly, to say that for those of you that aren't familiar with Canning House, we organise many events such as these to try and improve and stimulate understanding and debate around Latin America here in the UK. Please visit our website, www.canninghouse.org, so you can see what else that we do. And then thirdly, there is absolutely no way that you can bring together all of the remarks that have been made today. And so all I can say, speaking very, very personally, is it's amazing that we have all listened to one another. There is clearly such a big spectrum of views, and I suppose that only history will tell what this man will mean to Venezuela and to all of us. So thank you very much.